Good morning. Welcome to our study today. We are on chapter 2, verse 9, lesson 11 on that verse. I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Let's begin with a moment of prayer. Father Yahweh, we are grateful for your word. We're grateful for your love. We're grateful for your salvation. We thank you that through your Son, we have peace and we have understanding of your word and the means by which you communicate to us. As we study the events of human history to see how it coincides with the future history of your word, we ask for your insight as we see the Jews throughout their history to help us to identify those who say they are Jews and are not, so that we might understand events leading up to the last days and see then in the last days what there is to see without being deceived. We thank you for it in the name of Yahushua HaMashiach, Jesus, the Savior of the Jews and of we in the body of Christ. Amen. We have been looking for the possible candidates found in Revelation 2:9. I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. And also a similar verse in Revelation 3:9. Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. So this is the context. This is what precipitated this study, the fact that we see throughout the book of Revelation deception as the key feature of everything that goes on. And so since this was the beginning of the mention of deception in the book of Revelation, early in the book in chapter 2, I thought it expedient to go ahead and see if we could uncover those that are perpetrating the deception throughout the rest of the book, that might help us to understand things as we read it. And also for those who will be here prior to that time, to be able to see history unfolding in respect to those deceptive people who claim they are Jews but are not. We see the near destruction of the Jewish faith in Yahuwah to set the stage for an essentially atheistic Jewish state. The abandonment of relying on Hashem to regather the Jews under the Messiah and establish the Messianic kingdom by switching to human effort to establish their own perfect Zionist kingdom. Perfect, of course, is in their own eyes. We have looked at the genetic lines of Noah's son, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This then led us to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob, also known as Israel, the son through whom all Jews, both Israel and Judah, come. All Jews come through Jacob, through Israel, back through Isaac, back through Abraham, and back through Shem. There are no Jews from the tribe of Ham or the tribe of Japheth or Japheth. They are all other tribes, not Jews. So that was our first distinction, that to be a true Jew, you have to be from the line of Shem, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We then attempted to follow the 12 sons of Israel, or Jacob, as they were dispersed throughout the Middle East and Europe to try to find clues, specifically who are the real bloodline Jews. Our trouble with that is that there's been so much intermarriage and among the peoples of the Middle East and the peoples of Europe with the Jews, the true Jews, that it makes it difficult to track the genetics any more than just the fact that they are Middle Easterners and the tribe of Levi, we can track them. But the other tribes are almost impossible. Well, they are pretty much impossible to track with today's genetic technology. Improvements are being made almost daily in genetics. And so I expect that before too long, and I know that before the timetable of the last days in Revelation transpires, that they will know precisely who are the real Jews. I have only one caveat to that, and that's the fact that the deceivers in the first half of the book of Revelation are probably the Jews who say they're Jews and are not. I think then the real Jews will be discovered in chapter 12, and they compose the remnant, which we will begin studying week after next as we look into the New Testament information about this subject. After we conclude our look at the land of Israel, this week we will look at the establishment of the State of Israel, and next week we will look at the leadership in Israel and things that are happening there that also give us insight into the real Jews and the fake Jews. We saw the golden age of Jewry in Spain under the Muslims. We saw the resettlement of Jewish slaves in Germany after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, when they were taken by the soldier veterans, the veterans of the Roman army, to that area in Germany, the Rhine River area, that was called at that time Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz is a son of Japheth, therefore not a Jew. The Jews that we see today, most of the Jews in the world, identify themselves as Ashkenazi because they settled in that area of Germany that was known as Ashkenaz. There is no direct genetic relationship between those Jews who claim they are Ashkenazi now and Ashkenaz. And it's fortunate for them because if they were Ashkenaz, they would not be Jews. So Ashkenaz became symbolic of a culture and a region, just as Sephardi became a region and a culture in Spain. So that's the difference, and that also leads to confusion, and I have no doubt who the author of that confusion is. We looked at the east to west and then the west to east dispersions of the Jews. Lastly, we saw the migration into Poland and Ukraine. We noted the Jews' educational advantages and how it placed them in the highest position in governments and society, and then the push of the upper class Jews to integrate Jewry into secular society and thus integrate secular society into Judaism. 2 Timothy 3:13, while evil people and impostors will go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. Next, we took a day off and looked at the Jews in Ukraine and the current Russian invasion. Next, we looked at the final diaspora candidates the Russian Jews, the Russian revolutions and the development of communism, the conversion of secular capitalist Jews into Bolshevism, and how it influenced Zionism, and how that is continuing to determine the nature of the current secular state of Israel. Then we looked at the birth of modern Jewish politics, which began in the late 1800s. And last week we saw the buildup to World War II, and finally the Holocaust. The Holocaust being the event that transformed world opinion, which was predominantly anti-Semitic, into empathy and sympathy, and helped to launch the movement throughout the world to allow the Jews to move back into the land of Israel. We saw an overview of Jewry under the Soviet Union, beginning with the Russian revolutions of 2017 and the institution of communism, and following the history through the breakup of the Soviet Union and the freeing of the Jews to emigrate to Israel and the USA in the 1980s. This week, we will see the history of the formation of Zionist Israel and its Jewish leadership. Two major figures in the liberation movement, wars, and their subsequent political careers, Yitzhak Rabin and Menachem Begin. These are two important figures during the time of the liberation movement. Menachem Begin precedes Yitzhak Rabin in that story, so we will look at him first. Following World War II, the images of the results of Nazi barbarism flooded the world, and anti-Semitism changed to compassion, and the impetus to give them their own homeland pervaded free world sentiment, except in the halls of British politics, where their sentiments were divided between their longtime promises to the Jews and the reality of their vast oil holdings in Arab-controlled lands of the Middle East. They had made the Balfour Declaration that they would support the Jewish immigration and habitation of the land of Israel, and they had made various other statements to that effect. But when it came down to time, they had mixed sentiments, because they had, well over 50% of all oil production in the Middle East was under British Petroleum. And so they did not want to anger the Arabs by moving the Jews into Israel and lose their Arab oil drilling contracts. So that became a big contention, and actually resulted in some of the things that we'll see during the time of Menachem Begin. What followed was a Jewish revolt against Britain, with multiple terrorist attacks, illegal immigration by foreign Jews, and of course, conflict with the Arabs living side by side with them. We'll first see this in the life of Menachem Begin.
Ready to go? Okay. Thank you for coming. It's a nice turnout for the.
Having you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So it's nice to have a reasonable turnout in the off season. We'd like to welcome the Mayor of Surfside, Mr. Teicher, is here to join us. So a big round of applause. Okay. And we've got a fascinating presentation for us tonight. I really was hoping to be able to use my new clicker thing, but unfortunately the batteries are dead, so we're just going to have to do it without the batteries. But our topic for tonight is Menachem Begin, and the subtitle is A New Israel, because his 1977 revolution, when he came to power, represented a tremendous change in a lot of the thinking about Israel, the thinking within Israel, and as I hope to demonstrate in the next 48 minutes or so, really represents a tremendous step forward in terms of the maturation of Israel as a state. Many people feel it was not such a positive direction in which to mature, but nevertheless, we'll explore that in the next hour. I'd like to start with the joke, which I did receive from a member of the audience. I'm just going to adapt it a little bit. And Elia at TorahCafe.com is going to edit it out before we put it on the web, but the joke goes like this. There's this great rabbi who spends a lot of his life studying the Torah and teaching the Torah and counseling people and offering sermons and things like that. And after a long, well-lived life, he goes up to heaven. And the angels are very happy to see him. They say, "Welcome, Rabbi," and they take him into the anteroom, the vestibule. It's beautiful decor and big curtains and things like that. Angels moving back and forth, and they say, "Please have a seat here while we process your admission." And put him down on a nice sofa, give him a little cup of tea. And he's sitting there waiting, very pleased with himself, because this is the culmination of a life well lived. And all of a sudden, he hears in the distance a shofar blowing, and then angels start flying back and forth with great rapidity. And then they come out with these long trumpets, and they're blowing all kinds of sounds, and like everyone's in a tizzy. And he says, "What's going on?" And one of the angels say, "Didn't you hear? Didn't you hear? Shloimi, the Egged bus driver, is here. Shloimi, the Egged bus driver." Egged, of course, is the Israeli bus company, which is known for their somewhat chaotic and creative interpretation of the rules of the road. So anyways, he's saying, "Oh my gosh, it must be some tzaddik. It must be a hidden tzaddik, a tzaddik nistar, something like that." And he waits to see who's this Shloimi. And the angels bring in Shloimi, and he's wearing like a grimy pair of khaki pants and one of those white wife-beater shirts that's stained, and he's smoking, and he's spitting out sunflower seed shells, and he's swearing in Hebrew and things like that. And the angels just guide him in straight into the pearly gates, so to speak. I don't know if we have pearly gates, but you get the image. So the rabbi is saying, "Wow, that was quite a show," but I'm wondering, who was this Shloimi? Did not look like such a tzaddik that he should be rushed into heaven so much. And me, I really did dedicate my life to Torah and tefillah and to avoda. How come I'm sitting on the sofa? So he goes up to one of the angels and he says, "Was tutzach? How come he got ahead of me?" And they said to him, "Rabbi, you don't understand. When you get up and you give a sermon, everyone falls asleep. But when Shloimi drives his Egged bus, everyone starts davening." Okay. All right, that's it for the joke. It will be cut out of the online version. So tonight's topic, Menachem Begin, 1913 to 1992. This is actually the centennial of his birth. I believe his birthday is right around this time of year as well. I'm sorry I didn't look up the specific date, but we are at the centennial of his birth. How appropriate we should speak about him tonight. He is, of course, most famous for being the 6th Prime Minister of Israel, the first who did not come from the left-wing Mapai or Labor Party, as we shall see, a very important change in Israel. He is associated with a group called the Irgun, a very important pre-state British resistance movement, or resistance to the British movement, controversial as we shall discuss. But despite his very right-wing credentials, he definitely was a hawk, very warlike, with a sense of unease with regards peace treaties and accommodation with the Arabs. He was, ironically, the first Israeli prime minister to sign a peace treaty with any of the neighboring Arab states. So he was quite literally the hawk who made peace, and that peace, although it is not without some tension, nevertheless has maintained stability since 1978 when it first began. So he's an unusual figure, a figure with contradictions, a figure with internal turmoil, great tragedy in his own personal life and great victory at the same time, a man of incredible tenacity and a man of great achievement, as we shall discuss. So he was born in Brest-Litovsk, which was then in Poland. His father came from a long line of rabbis, although he himself was not practicing as a rabbi. He was working in the lumber business. The family was also very Zionistic. In many ways, actually, is kind of like my grandmother, Allah Shalom, her sort of orientation with pro-Hebraic, pro-Zionist, Eastern European orientation. As a youth, he first enrolled in a group called the Hashomer HaTzair youth group. The Hashomer HaTzair is a very left-wing, really communist Zionist group, but he left after 2 years, and at the age of 14 he joined a much more right-wing group called Beitar. Hashomer HaTzair means the young guard, and that is a really sort of communist-sounding phrase, like Komsomol, the communist youth, things like that. Beitar, on the other hand, is a reference to a place name in Israel, the Great Battle of Beitar, associated with the rebellion against the Romans in ancient times, which was a site of a great victory for the Romans and tragedy for the Jews, but nevertheless it's a symbol of Jewish resistance to occupation. And that's really the motivating principle of Beitar, was to train youth in in Poland, for an eventual paramilitary role in Israel in the forthcoming Zionist state. He went to law school at the University of Warsaw. He gained his law degree, but he never practiced law, although his expertise in language was well noted even as a young man. He was fluent in classic languages, in many European languages. He wrote and spoke in English, and of course in classical Hebrew as well, and he was famous for being a great orator. His critics called him a demagogue, but nevertheless he was definitely a master of the spoken word, something that he attributed to his training in Warsaw. But his principal influence, without a doubt, was a man that he frequently called Mori Urebi, my master and teacher, Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky is a fascinating, very important character. Perhaps in later classes we'll look at his life in detail. But basically, he swam in the opposite direction of much of the secular Jewish movements of the day. Communism, socialism, the idea of druzhba narodov, we explored in previous classes, the idea that the Jews should participate in a proletarian world in which there is no more criticism between nationalities, there's no more racism, no more hatred. That's where most Jews were kind of voting. And if they were Zionists as well, they were voting with their feet to create that kind of reality in the State of Israel, what would be the State of Israel. We discussed it last week with Golda Meir. It was typical for much of the youth of Poland at the time. Jabotinsky, on the other hand, had a radically different approach. Jabotinsky felt that fundamentally the Jews had to go it alone. This idea of all the nations setting aside their differences once they recognized that their true enemies were not national enemies, they were class enemies. He felt that was all garbage. It was all just hogwash that people were lovingly drinking up, but it was meaningless. He felt that ultimately the Jews had to stand on their own 2 feet, and they had to take responsibility for their own survival and not trust to the general goodwill of society as a whole. This is also in great contrast to Herzl, who, although Herzl was not a socialist by any means, his vision of Israel was something like, Vienna on the Mediterranean. If you ever seen Haifa, for example, that's really kind of Herzl's city. People get along, they're polite, they say hello to each other in the streets, and there's not too much fighting going on. That's really what Herzl had in mind. So Herzl was spending most of his time going from world power to world power with the early shuttle diplomacy, trying to convince the head of England, the head of Germany, and so on to support the Zionist venture. Jabotinsky said that's all a waste of time. We can't trust anybody. We must do it on our own. The critics of Jabotinsky said he was an early integral nationalist. That's kind of like the nice technical term for fascist, meaning that they were very into typical things that were associated with the fascists. A chauvinistic attitude, the idea that the Jews are better than everybody else. A militaristic bent, very much into parades and insignia and paramilitary drills. Less of a democratic structure, more of a charismatic leadership structure. These kinds of ideas were definitely associated with Jabotinsky. At the same time, I think it's unfair to put him in this kind of camp because he had a very broad-minded approach to the national struggle of many other peoples. And in contradistinction to many of his peers, for example, he felt very positively about the Ukrainian national movement, which was excoriated by many Jews at that time. So he was a really complicated character. Begin encountered him at an early age and became his right-hand man. By the age of 22, he was already appearing beside him at the World Congress of Revisionists, which was the name of Jabotinsky's party, as we shall see. And Jabotinsky's perhaps greatest claim to fame was his backing of Jewish self-defense. Recall that during this period, there are ongoing waves of pogroms against Jews in Eastern Europe, most notably the beginning of the 1880s, and then with increasing rapidity and ferocity in the first decade of the 20th century, the second decade of the 20th century, just incredible numbers of attacks on Jews in small villages. So Jabotinsky argued that Jews should organize their own self-defense societies, where typically young Jews would get together, train themselves, and be prepared for the attacks of hooligans that would typically come on the railroads at the time. He was beloved by the youth. He was mistrusted by the older generation, who felt that these self-defense units would just exacerbate the problem and it would look like a provocation, whereas the older Jews were saying, you know what, we should just keep things calm, we should follow what the Torah says, pray for the welfare of the government so that they leave us alone. Jabotinsky represented a radical new type of thinking that was ultimately very influential. Now, what I'm going to show you here today, I'm very proud of. My daughter, Danit Malka, helped me put this slide together. You know, most of my slides are very simple with no animation or things like this. Is going to be animation super. Because, and I just have to give you a little history lesson, most of you in this room remember the old teaching technology called chalkboards. Remember? So my wife actually, many years ago, she bought me a little metal sleeve to hold the chalk in, because otherwise I would come home, my right side was just covered in chalk from teaching. And I used to teach this particular class on a blackboard, not even a green board. And then, I started going to transparencies. Remember those plastic clear sheets you would write on them? So then I used that. And then when I went to PowerPoint, I couldn't do it. And now finally, with my Mac, I figured out how to do it with my daughter's help. And so I'm going to go back to old style teaching, but it's very complicated. Get ready. Okay, so it's an important moment for me. So here, this is the thing. The political spectrum. So for the rest of the world, the political spectrum only has two ends to it, right? Left and right. That's very simple. It's, towards the socialist end and towards the capitalist end. And that's push it. That's obvious. Jews can't leave it alone. It has to be more complicated. We have two axes for our political spectrum, a left to right and an up and down. So here we go. Let me label these. There are four cardinal points. The first is Zionism. The second is something called Doekite, which I'll explain to you what that means in a second. The third is capitalism. The fourth is socialism. So what are these four elements in the Jewish political spectrum? So let's put Zionism up here. And by Zionism, obviously, we understand the movement to create a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine. We've spoken about it in a few different lectures, but that's going to be at the top, the y-axis of this spectrum. Doekite, the word do in Yiddish means here. So Doekite means here-ness. And it's the opposite of Zionism in that some Jews, let's say in Poland, would say, we should be striving to create a Jewish polity over there, Dortekite if you want, there in Israel. But other Jews would say, no, let's reorganize ourselves here in Poland, a diaspora nationalism. So Jews would separate along this y-axis, some more towards Dortekite, more towards Zionism. Then, of course, on the right wing, we have capitalism. I think it's unfair to really call Jews fascists for reasons that are obvious, but there are some that definitely go further to the right, as we shall see. But capitalism is essentially, in favor of the free market economy, John Smith, The idea that, as long as you give people as much freedom so that they do not impinge on others' freedoms, then the society will prosper as a whole, and so on. And that's contrasted with socialism, which is the idea that, no, you have to have a command economy controlled from the top that regulates how income is generated and spent and shared and so on. Those are our 4 cardinal points. Any questions so far about these? It's as clear as the sun at noonday. But wait, it will get more confusing. So let's look at some of the main political parties of the day. And by the way, right now I'm talking about the period between, let's say, 1905, when the Tsarist Empire first allowed political parties to actively work, until 1912, which is the foundation of one of the last parties we'll talk about. So this is what the complexion of Jews politically were at the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The so-called Allgemeine Zionisten, or general Zionists, so-called because they had to be distinguished from about 7 other kinds of Zionists. This is basically Herzl's party. They were the largest single Zionist party, and they were obviously on the top end of this scale towards Zionism, but they also believed in capitalism. They felt that, the new Jewish land in Palestine should be basically a Western economy. These are contrasted with the Bundists, and this was basically a communist-style party. They were social democrats who were both socialist and very much not in favor of Zionism. They felt that Zionism was moving backwards against the tide of history, which tried to minimize national differences. The Bundists said we should try to the Zionists, the trend of history is to minimize national differences. They wanted to be down here with Doakite. Then the third group would be the Poalei Zion. We spoke about them last week with Golda Meir. This is her party. The Workers of Zion, who believe in Zionism, and at the same time, they are socialists. They want Israel to exist, to be the Jewish homeland, but they want it to be a socialist country. And then finally, the last group, which is the Volkspartei, very small group. This is Shimon Dubnov's party that we spoke about many weeks ago, that believed, no, we should work on Jewish politics here in the diaspora, and it should be fundamentally capitalist. Okay. Any questions so far? Yes, go ahead.
Volkspartei, is that the correct spelling?
That's a Yiddish transliteration. Yeah, it's these.
Maybe I was getting a little crazy.
You could call it, it's Volkspartei in Yiddish, because it's a Yiddishist party. Okay, we're all right with this? Now, here's an important party for us. These are the revisionists. The revisionists, this is Jabotinsky's party. This is the intellectual origins of Menachem Begin's policies. The revisionists, so-called because they wanted to revise things, they took their cue from the revisionist parties after World War I as well, that parties that were unhappy with the status quo and wanted to change everything. They are ultra-Zionist and ultra-capitalist in the sense that they want no truck with other peoples. They really believed in the toxicity of non-Jews, and they were untrustworthy, and they had to be handled kind of like, at a full arm's length, and essentially the Jews had to stand on their own 2 feet and just take it. They believed in much more aggressive, even violent means to achieve this end, very militaristic, and very kind of pessimistic about the possibility of a flourishing of peace in the region. Now we'll see how that plays out in Menachem Begin's life in a moment. So far, have you really enjoyed the animation? Did you like the?
Fine.
Yeah. So now here, I normally don't like this, but since I learned how to do it, I started having fun. Let me tell you what happened to these parties, just to jump ahead in our lecture a little bit. What happened to these parties since then? So I'm going to take you up to the present day. What happens to these parties? So first of all, what happened to the Bund? Boom. Isn't that cool? Did you like that? It came dropping down and made like the dust. Okay. They became, in the Soviet Union, they became communists, and then Stalin killed them all. So that was it for them. In the United States, they became a group called the Workmen's Circle, which some of you may have some familiar with. It was very popular in the first half of the 20th century, a kind of a quasi-socialist Jewish group, very active in New York City in particular. Now here goes. All right. Now here's another animation That's nice. Kind of the star that goes by like that. The Volkspartei had a major influence on the structure of the Jewish Federation movement. Obviously, the Federation is not a party, but the philosophy of Volkspartei influenced the Federation, and they essentially observe its teachings. Here's the third one, the Poale Zion. Wow, that's the flashing bulbs. They became the Labor Party, and the general Zionists and the revisionists joined, and they formed this party, the Flames, right? Likud. So that's where we are today. Sort of the major orientations of like, as they say in Yiddish, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. All right, nothing changes. It's always the same. It's not actually Yiddish, but I think at least one of you knows that. Okay, so that's basically where we're looking at now. Begin, Jabotinsky are way over here in the revisionist corner, and they've got all these other parties that disagree with them. Okay. So back to his life. He was very, very active in Beitar, the youth wing of Jabotinsky's revisionist movement, and he actually would travel around Europe, garnering support and encouraging young people to join this movement. And while he was traveling around, he would stay, of course, in the homes of various wealthy supporters. It was at one of these homes that he met a young woman named Eliza Arnold, and 1 month later they were married. And they had an incredible relationship that lasted until her death. I guess it would be about, I can't do the math off the top of my head, but they had a very, very strong relationship that lasted to the end of her life. And in fact, when she eventually passed away, he was devastated, and it really represented the end of his career and ultimately his life as well. She was a retiring figure who really stood in the background whenever possible. In fact, when she was honored, when Begin was invited to speak with Jimmy Carter after he became prime minister, she was honored at a dinner of that nature, and the audience was shocked that she refused to speak. She just got up and said thank you, and they said, aren't you going to make a speech about politics or Israel? And she said, my husband is the speaker, and she sat down. So she really was a kind of stay in the background kind of person, but she endured tremendous suffering on behalf of her husband that was really quite remarkable. Here she is, of course, shown with their oldest son, Benny. They had 3 children. Benny later went into politics, Benny Begin. In this particular picture, it's taken from when he was in hiding in Israel. He was on the hunt. He was hunted by the British, and so he pretended to be an Orthodox rabbi named Sassover, I think, living in a regular neighborhood where even Irgun members, and he was the leader of Irgun, had no idea who he was. And they were like inviting him into their secret circles and things like that when he was really... No, yeah, that's true. We'll get to that. But still in Poland. So he's in Poland in the late 1930s. And he happens to be working primarily on organizing illegal immigration to Palestine. He's organizing Jews, organizing boats, trying to get them into the land of Israel when war breaks out. He happened to be in Lithuania at the outbreak of the war, and Lithuania had kind of a tragic moment of peace at the beginning of the war because Stalin and Hitler had not completely worked out who was going to take over a portion of that territory. It happened that once that was settled, Begin found himself on the Soviet side, and since he was a prominent Zionist activist, he was arrested by the Soviets before he could be arrested by the Nazis, who would of course invade Lithuania a couple years later. He was sent out to the Gulag, where he was tortured and imprisoned for several years for his activity with the party. This is his Soviet mugshot from the time. But then what happened, as we discussed in previous classes, is that in June 22nd of 1941, the Nazis double-crossed Stalin, and they invaded the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden the Soviet Union looked to their prisoners in the various gulags to see if they could dig up some allies to fight the Nazis. So Begin was released to join the Polish army, which was then fighting on the Eastern Front with the Nazis. And ultimately, from the Polish army, he was transferred to Israel in May of 1942. Well, because the division of the Polish army, the Jewish Polish soldiers, they set up a special unit in Palestine to fight alongside the British. Because remember, the British and the Polish are allies at this point, and that's his kind of circuitous route. Ironically, he wanted to stay in Eastern Europe and continue fighting against the Nazis, but he was urged by his followers to go take the fight to Israel. Which wasn't the same kind of fight at all, because there was no hostilities, active hostilities, no front line in Israel itself. But of course, that was the homeland, and ultimately he was had much more of an impact there in Israel. At this time, if we move to Israel and understand what's going on, we skipped over this a little bit last week because it's more relevant to us in our lecture today. The Arab-Israeli relationship is going south very rapidly. There's a lot of debate over the demographics about how many people actually lived in Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century, but there's no question that the Jewish population and the Arab population grew proportionately, which leads many Israeli interpreters to say that as more Jews moved to Israel and created more of an economic infrastructure, bringing a lot of Western support with them, a lot of Western know-how, draining the swamps, that kind of image, a lot of Arabs were also attracted from Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan for the economic opportunities that this new population represented. And that was going fine until the 1920s, because the Poale Zion, which you recall, they are like the more socialist, more dovish orientation, which dominated Israeli politics for so long. They discovered that some of their socialist ideologies were counterproductive in the land of Israel. Specifically, they had two values that came into conflict with one another. On the one hand, they wanted to have, obviously, peaceful, harmonious relations with the indigenous Arab population or the new Arab populations. That was to be sure. But on the other hand, they valued, as socialists, the notion that Jews should get their fingers in the dirt. They should work with their backs with the land. They really wanted to get away from the kind of, Eastern European mentality of Jews as accountants or Jews as indoor people, pasty, scholarly, weaklings. They wanted to have strong new Jews who are farmers, who work the land. So the Arabs loved the economic opportunities of the manual labor, picking the oranges and tending to the crops and things like that. But that meant that a lot of the Jews ended up being like kind of small businessmen, managing these farms or managing commercial relations with the Arabs, and they were not creating the new Jew that they so hoped to do. So the Poale Zion instituted a policy of Jewish labor that was intended to get regular Jews, off their butts in their offices and into the fields working. Excuse my language. Can we cut that out, Elia, please, when you do the Torah Cafe version? Get them into the fields, muscular and tanned, and that's the kind of idea. But that meant that the Arabs didn't have work, because they had to let go of the Arabs in order to hire the Jews to work in the fields. And this sparked a significant amount of economic protest, because a lot of Arabs said, what is this? We came here, you need work, you're not hiring us, that's discrimination. And so you had an increasing level of economic tension that eventually morphed into a violent conflict. There's several major riots of this nature. They were tied to other elements as well. I'm making it very simplistic by looking just at the economic aspect of it. But the rioting, it kind of mirrored the pogrom activity in Eastern Europe, and it was escalating rather than getting better. So this is the environment into which Jabotinsky found himself with the Arabs. Added to that was the fact that the British had just published a very anti-Zionist position paper called the White Paper that was an attempt to deal with the violence that was increasing between Arabs and Jews. The White Paper was compared by this thing called the Peel Commission that argued for essentially a separation of Jews and Arabs with some internalization of certain zones like Jerusalem and so on. But on the whole, it benefited the Arab position. And many Jews felt that they had been betrayed by the British, who had in 1917 made that fantastic Balfour Declaration to include in their goals the idea of a homeland for Jews in Palestine. The worst part of it, of course, was the World War, and especially the constriction on immigration. You recall that, we're moving quickly through the period, but Britain is in control of Israel at this time. Britain is obviously fighting against the Nazis. The Arabs decide to join with the Axis powers. So the Arab nations surrounding Israel become pro-German. And England here has a little foothold in the Middle East. They are obviously pro-allies. So the Palestinian Jews, like Begin at this time, decide that they're going to throw in their lot with the British against the Arabs, because even though they don't want the British there and they feel that the British are persecuting them and not allowing enough Jews to live there and so on, at the same time, the enemy that they share, the Nazis, was far more grievous than their temporary difficulties. And so therefore, the various Jewish underground movements said at this point, you know what, we're complaining about the British, we don't like the restrictions they placed on us, but we are going to suspend that, and we are going to cooperate with the British in our attempt to rid the world of Nazism. Shortly after the war, which of course ends positively in terms of the major conflict, the Brits immediately return to that very restrictive immigration policy, which is disastrous because after the Holocaust, you have an incredible number of displaced Jews. Somewhere, I'm just guessing now, but there has to be at least 3 or 4 million displaced Jews who cannot go to their homes, either because of the political situation, a lot of these homes have been overrun by the communists now, or because of the hostility that's still regnant there, or even more basically, the notion that they're not wanted back home. The notorious pogrom in Kielce in 1946, in which Jews were accused after the Holocaust of drinking the blood of Christian children, was, was just a clarion call for Jews to get out of the graveyard of Europe and go to Israel. So you have all these Jews who are amassing in displaced persons camps, and they want to go to Israel. World opinion looks upon this with favor after the news of the tremendous devastation of the Holocaust gets out, and Britain is increasingly beleaguered trying to keep these Jews out of Israel, because that antagonizes the Arabs, when they're really losing this major opinion poll in the world in terms of public opinion. So Begin again is involved in smuggling Jews into Palestine, and as we discussed at length last week, so I won't go into detail here, the United Nations decides to partition Israel. The Jews accept the partition plan, the Arabs reject it, and you have a massive war that lasts over a year, which ultimately Israel emerges from successfully. Yes, Ms. Weiser.
There was in Haifa a Nazi colony, or a lot of German people living in Haifa at that time, at the same time, and there were riots against, they make riots against the Jews coming into Palestine also.
Oh, that's fascinating. I've never heard of a Nazi colony in Israel. There are definitely Germans there, but I did not know it was that. Wow.
Very
but on the television here.
Wow. Now, my grandmother, she always used to say that the jails are full in Israel too. That was a bit of wisdom.
It's inclusive, even in a tour of Haifa, they take you to where the Germans used to live, but they were really acting as being part of the Nazi party.
Incredible, incredible.
So I wonder what was the reaction from the British people.
Your question exceeds my ability to answer. It's fascinating. I'll have to look it up. Okay, shall we go on a little bit? I've got more stuff on Begin we got to go to. Okay, so what was Begin doing at this time? Again, the Irgun was the collective name for his new movement in Israel. He rapidly became the leader of the Irgun, which was most distinguished from something called the Haganah. Haganah literally means defense, and the Haganah was basically the military wing of the Mapai Labor Party. The socialist, Coalition party had its own forces, and they implemented policies that were consistent with the ideals of socialism. The Irgun, which means essentially the organization, was based on revisionist principles, and not surprisingly, these two military forces often came to severe disagreement and even blows. Very significant conflict on a number of occasions. The most significant question was, how do we deal with the British? The Haganah wanted to adopt a much more diplomatic approach while clearly opposing the British and wanting them to lift their restrictions on immigration and so on. They felt that the British were ultimately civilized people and they could sit down and talk with them, and that there was a way to perhaps work things out. The Irgun, again, consistent with the revisionist principles, felt that that was just, a pipe dream and not worth thinking about at all. The only way to get the British out of Israel was to drive them out. And they implemented policies that were much more aggressive towards the British. Most importantly, the notorious bombing of the King David Hotel in July of 1946. This was the headquarters of the British in Israel, and the warnings were issued. The Irgun placed several bombs in the basement of this hotel, which of course still stands in Israel today. It was rebuilt. And they issued several warnings in several different media, including phone calls to the switchboard itself. And the British ignored those warnings. There was a major investigation afterwards, and the British, although definitely holding the Irgun to blame for this attack, they also took some responsibility themselves for not heeding those warnings. Part of the reason perhaps for not heeding the warnings was because bomb threats were very common and they were typically ignored, like fire drills in condominiums here in Surfside, that kind of thing. But the bombs did in fact go off in the middle of the day when the building was at its peak capacity. 91 people were killed and 46 were hurt, and that includes British citizens, Jews, and Arabs as well. And this represented a major turning point in the escalation of violence between the Israeli underground and the British. And a bounty was placed on Begin's head. I'll show you the picture of it in a minute, where he was. They would offer 10,000 pounds for anyone who could bring him back dead or alive, because he was the leader and mastermind of this movement. There was also very, very harsh criticism from the Jewish Haganah, who wanted to call off this entire episode. And Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of the Mapai party, he was later the first prime minister of Israel, he felt that Begin was a type of terrorist that was harming the Jewish cause with these kinds of intemperate actions. And in some cases, the Haganah even captured the Irgun fighters and gave them over to the British. Nice. So the Haganah is at the same time fighting the British, but the Jews have not got their act together either. The Haganah and the Irgun are fighting bitterly as well. Yes, Mr. Lax.
What was the purpose or the expected result from trying to warn the switchboard and the
Well, I don't think that the Irgun's intent was to kill. Their intent was to send a message that, you're not safe anywhere. And by the way, we should realize that this is happening to the British at the same time in India. They're having a miserable time with Mahatma Gandhi, with Jinnah and the Muslim Brotherhood, Muslim Party, I forget what they call it over there, and the British essentially give up on India at the same time too. They're just taking a beating from their colonial powers because they're no longer wanted in those places. So the idea was to send a clear message: we don't want you here, and the message was certainly received. Yes.
Well, I think that it proved out that the Irgun was right as far as the British was concerned, because in most instances, most of the people that were British that were in Palestine at the time really didn't give much of a hoot for the Jews or their position.
I'm not going
I don't wanna take
I don't want to
this
pass
way.
judgment. My goal here is to just try and present the facts in as neutral a position as way, and of course you can interpret them any way you like. But I'm doing my best to maintain objectivity. I have students who are on the other end of that camera that have to hear this. Okay. Anyway, here's a kind of a cool bounty picture, and it's helpfully circled for us too. Okay, another major event which occurred in the context of the Arab-Israeli war, and very important for understanding Begin's policies and Israeli politics afterwards, is the massacre at an Arab village called Deir Yassin. It really deserves a far more detailed treatment than I can provide in the short time I've allotted. But basically what happened was Irgun and allied Lehi forces attacked an Arab village that was significant for strategic reasons. And although Begin himself was not involved in the operation, he was not present at the time, he argued for restraint. Something went wrong. There's a lot of debate over what went wrong exactly, but there was a horrible massacre of men, women, and children in this little village. Numbers differ. Some bring it as low as 100 people, others place it as high as 300, but it's universally recognized that this was a massacre of civilians by an early resistance movement that had become part of the Israeli Defense Forces, and the Israelis were roundly criticized for this atrocity. Again, if we had more time, we can go into the back and forth as to how it went wrong. The warnings were issued, the loudspeakers weren't working, they were fired upon first, there are all kinds of things circling around, but the bottom line is there were about 200 dead civilians at the hands of a force of this nature. What is especially important for our purposes, though, is that Deir Yassin was a major turning point for the beginning of the Palestinian refugee problem, because many Arabs in Israel said, my gosh, these people are savages, and they fled Israel. They fled the war zone. Now, many Arabs felt that they would soon be returning with victorious Arab armies and claiming property from the Jews who had been driven into the sea. But any way you look at it, there was this fear generated that the Arabs were not safe in the new Israel, and that they had to leave simply for the safety of their own families. And again, you can politicize the event, but it is a turning point in the Arab-Israeli relationship early on in the war. And at the same time, once again, while the Arabs and the Israelis are fighting, the Israelis and the Israelis are fighting. And perhaps the worst moment is the so-called Altalena affair, which is in June 1948. The Altalena was the name of a boat that was commissioned to bring immigrants making aliyah to Israel from Europe, from the displaced persons camp, along with a large container load or a large cargo of weapons, including tanks, machine guns, large weaponry. And the agreement was that since this was a boat that was to be that was entirely financed by Irgun supporters, and there were Irgun members on board, that these weapons would go to the new Irgun units of the Israeli Defense Forces. Remember that when the state was declared, you had all these kind of ragtag militia with various degrees of organization, with different political complexions. They were not a unified army with uniforms and chain of command and things like that. They had to kind of patch together these various groups into a unified fighting force. So the Irgun said, sure, we're going to cooperate with Ben Gurion's Haganah, but we have our own guns, thank you, and we have all our own people, and we're going to work it this way. So they hammered out an agreement about how to divide the arms, and they came to disagreement once this boat reached Israeli shores. It went up and down the coast a little while, with the Irgun demanding more of a share of the weapons, the Haganah demanding their share of the weapons, and ultimately, again, it may be a whole series of missed radio communications, but the Haganah fired on the Irgun ship and actually set it ablaze, and it was eventually scuttled, as you can see here, within view of the Tel Aviv beach. So this is, more left-wing Ben Gurion Haganah forces firing on a ship full of Irgun Jews and weapons, losing all the weapons in the process, killing a handful, about 16 people were killed. Begin was on the ship, and there's a large supposition that perhaps they were hoping to assassinate Begin personally because he was such a thorn in their side. Ultimately, Begin did make it ashore. There was a gunfight between these various forces on shore as well, and they managed to get a ceasefire and patch it together, but it showed a great moment of betrayal of the Irgun cause by the more left-wing Haganah. Mr. Lax.
Did Yitzhak Rabin have a role in this?
I don't remember what Rabin's role in it, but I'm sure he was involved. It was Ben Gurion for sure. Yes, Ms. Abramson. Oh my gosh. Okay, there you go. Thank you, Ms. Abramson. You're destined to be a historian one day, unless you can find a better Parnassa. Okay.
Ben was involved in that.
No kidding. You were involved in this as well?
Yes, I was.
That's amazing. Do you want to share anything with us?
Not
Mr. Rodriguez,
particularly.
good. Now, I have students who would like to hear something. I give you the microphone. Just tell us something about your experience. Just something.
Well, we were called out. I was in a brigade with Yitzhak Rabin,
Uh-huh.
and we were called out to Kfar Vitkin. It was a settlement on the ocean, not far from Tel Aviv, not to let the people from the Altalena to come ashore.
Oh my gosh. That's phenomenal.
And they were right, because Begin had just a fight with the British. He had no history of building up the country or anything.
Yeah. he
So
came in.
they didn't let them. They didn't let them to come ashore.
So did you actually see the events of the picture?
Yeah, I saw the whole thing.
Wow, that's amazing. Look at that. See, this is, where else are you going to get history lectures like this? I'm telling you, that's great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's move on. I've got about 10 minutes left. Now, immediately after the War of Independence ends, Begin joins the loyal opposition, which, as I saw in one interesting online article, he was probably in the opposition longer than any other political figure in Western history. He was in the opposition from 1948 until he came to power in 1977. An amazingly strong record of tenacity. He was an incredibly strong critic of the left, and Ben Gurion in particular, and the Altalena affair was, you know, his moment of clarity for all those things. And he stood in great contrast to these leftist figures, whereas, you know, the socialist kind of ideal was very working class proletarian. They would walk in shirt sleeves and no tie and very casual, whereas Begin was always seen only in a suit and tie, always, you know, speaking very carefully. He had this concept of hadar, which means like kind of glory or beauty that he took from Jabotinsky, the idea that you have to look like a mensch at all times. And his critique of the leftist government was very strong, including a major 1952 demonstration that turned into a riot in Israel because Begin felt that they should not accept any of the reparation money coming from Germany in Israel. He felt that it was a travesty to the memory of those who were killed in the Holocaust, and he had quite a few supporters that led to a major riot, even though they ended up continuing this. Now, it's interesting to note that the name of his party was Cherut, which means freedom, Cherut, and I heard from Simi Schreiber that he quoted someone, I can't remember, that Begin led us from avoda to Cherut, from slavery to freedom, right? Okay, well, anyways, yes, please. Abdus Lacherus, thank you.
He was a member of the unity government in 1967. There's a very interesting account in the,
That's true.
in the Prime Minister's by Yehuda Abner. I should have put my book. It's a very fascinating account.
It's an excellent book, amazing book.
Some news people questioning him and so on and so forth, but he was a member of the...
That's true. He joined the National Unity Government during the Six-Day War.
And convincing people to do certain things.
Right, absolutely. I should clarify that. By the loyal opposition, he did not lead the government, but he was a minister without portfolio in that government of 67. Now here, I know that what I'm going to present to you, to most of you in this room now, is going to be obvious and old material, but remember I have 19 through 24-year-olds who are watching this online, so I'm going to give them some information that may be shocking to them. And that is something about how the Israeli government works. It's very important to understand this in order to get a sense of it. So, here's a picture of what our current American government looks like, which, according to some opinions, is, not entirely functional. But so here's the Senate. We have two bodies, of course. Here's the Senate. We have 45% of the membership is Republican, 53% is Democratic, with 2% who are independent. These are rough numbers. The actual numbers of seats are different. I rounded it out. Here in the House of Representatives, we have 53% Republican, 46% Democratic, and of course 0% who are independent or vacant right now. And this is, it's hard to get politics done when you have a pretty evenly divided situation like this. But look at what Israel looks like by contrast. Okay, so you've got, let's see, I've got 3, 6, 9, 12 parties dividing up 120 seats. And there are about 7 parties that didn't get enough votes to get a seat, but they're still in the elections. So how are you supposed to get any politics done when you have this kind of situation? So the very important thing you have to realize about Israeli politics, and again, I apologize to those of you for whom this is obvious, is everything in Israeli politics is about coalitions. Whenever they have an election, the president, which is largely a ceremonial figure, it's not a president like here where they're elected and so on. The president there is more of a figurehead for the state. The president invites the leader of the bloc that has the largest chunk. In this case, right now, that would be Likud, joined with Yisrael Beitenu, who has 26% of the seats, and says, okay, you have 26% of the seats, you have to get 51%, so go out, you have 2 weeks to make deals with the smaller parties to get them to join your coalition so you can have 51%. So they've never had, except for the time when they have national unity governments, when the two largest blocs come together, and that's only in the case of war, really, to deal with an external threat, they've never had one party that controls 51% of the seats in the Senate. There's always these very complicated arrangements between various parties trying to agree on a common cause. And it makes Israeli politics in many ways very fragile and easily toppled over. So in this case, we have, in Israeli history, the labor movement had controlled the government, largely because of their coalitions with other parties from its inception in 1948 until the 1977 rebellion, or revolution, when suddenly Begin won the election. Now, he had been slowly gaining in popularity, but and here I mentioned, here's the national unity government. I have 1969. It should be 1967. I'm sorry. It was a difficult time for him to be in the government. He had a lot of disagreements with his co-members in the cabinet. But there were two populations in Israel, two large demographics that had felt largely disenfranchised by Israeli politics. Those were specifically the Sephardim, large numbers of Jews from Arab lands who had come to Israel after its establishment. In many cases, they were refugees because the Arabs, displaced them, expelled them once Israel was established, and they felt alienated from the very Ashkenazi, Eastern European approach of the traditional leadership of Israel. And secondly, religious voters, because the Israeli polity was led primarily by socialists who were anti-clerical, who were anti-religious, unfriendly to religion. And so you have all these Orthodox Jews, or even in the case of many Sephardim, let's say, Orthodox friendly, even though not especially observant, but they affiliated themselves as Orthodox, and they find themselves shut out of a government that's largely socialist and Ashkenazi. So these two large demographic bubbles began to grow, and their resentment was eventually sparked by Begin's standing for election. And he, although he himself was not strictly observant by contemporary standards, he was definitely very religious friendly, and he definitely knew how to speak to the Sephardim. And so these two groups really propelled him into the position of authority in 1977. Now, if you recall this wonderful slide, I want to make it more complicated, because we can't forget about these guys. Remember that we have these four axes. Okay, I'm going to have to go through the whole thing. Now this part, I wish my clicker ran out of batteries. You know, Torah Cafe, will you send me a regular supply of batteries so that I can keep this going? Okay, I'm joking. I'll get some batteries. So here's our 4 groups, and here's our parties. Come on. Right, we saw them before. Here's my favorite one. Oh no, not this one. Here's my favorite one. You ready? Wow, that's great. We should have some sound that go with it. Can I put sound on this? Okay, great. Okay, now, these are all our parties. We saw them before, but Jews can't leave this alone. There's not only 2 axes, there's a 3rd axis, like a cube, a z-axis. It looks like this. So as it were, you've already got a political spectrum that's doubled because of up and down, but now it has depth as well. And who's on this axis? The religious parties. We didn't talk about those guys at all. But now there are also religious parties that are active since 1912. One of them that's very important is the National Religious Party, which feels that the expansion of Israel is a religious imperative. Much more in line with Jabotinsky's ideal that, you know, the land of Israel has to expand to incorporate all the immigrants that will come in the time of Messiah. And so they see this aggressive attitude towards the Arabs as a religious idea. Now that's obviously not the only position held by religious Jews. Another one that dates from before the war, called the Agudat Yisrael, also very popular and strong here in America today. They were religious, but they did not believe in Zionism as a political desideratum. They felt that Zionism had to wait for the Messiah. But have you heard that the Agudat Yisrael, they have a presence in Israel as well? That's because after the Holocaust, whoops. Oh no, I'm not going to do through the whole thing. Oh my gosh, that would be terrible. But basically what happened, this is my favorite part too. I pushed the wrong button. Okay, come on, fast forward. We'll go through these. Come on. I know, this is tedious. I'm not going to do this again. Bang, that's my favorite one. Okay, there we go. Here we go. Israeli politics, oh my gosh. You know, Republicans and Democrats, this lecture would be over if we were only doing them. Okay, here we go. And here's the here's the Agudat Yisrael. And after the Holocaust, because there was really no Jews left in Eastern Europe, they moved to the Zionist position. And so you've got these 2 parties over here who are significant. They can be major power brokers in contemporary Israel. And we can add other parties as well, like Shas and so on. They join with the Likud, and they give Begin that bump that puts him over the edge and gives him the election. I'm going to have to skip on a little bit because I'm running out of time. The most dramatic moment in Begin's premiership, without a doubt, is his remarkable peace with Egypt. Now, as Yehuda Avner points out very effectively in his book, Begin did do a lot of the groundwork to allow it to happen. He knew Sadat's travel itinerary. Anwar Sadat, of course, the president of Egypt. And Begin traveled to those same locations, like to see the Shah of Tehran, for example, Shah of Iran. And he met with him before Sadat would show up. And he would tell him, listen, if Sadat ever makes any overtures, we'd love to talk with him. And then, of course, he would go back to Israel, and Sadat would visit the Shah of Iran. The Shah would say, you know, I just met with Menachem Begin, and he said really nice things about you. Kind of like Aharon, making peace, ironically. So when Sadat made a rather dramatic speech in Egypt about the possibility of bilateral talks with Israel, which was something that was in both Israel and Egypt's interest, because Jimmy Carter was trying to push multilateral talks in Geneva that had some disadvantages for them. Then Sadat said he would be open to the idea of talking with anyone, even Israel, about peace. So right away, Begin initiated a conversation, and dramatically, Sadat took a plane to Israel to meet with him. A phenomenal sea change in Middle Eastern politics. I happen to remember it. I was only 2 years old at the time, but I do remember seeing it on TV. Not quite 2, but this is a picture of them greeting at the airport. Begin, again, consistent with his pro-religious attitude, insisted that his plane only arrive well after Shabbat on Saturday night, so that people could, you know, observe the Shabbat and then hear about this and so on. And of course, as we know, they were able to hammer out a peace treaty. I don't have time to go into the details of it, but one of the more difficult things was that essentially Begin gave the entire Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. They had conquered it in 1967. They surrendered it in 1979 Accords. That was basically accepted by the Israeli population, but some very, very difficult moments as they dismantled the settlement of Yamit. In particular, in 1982, here you can see Israeli soldiers actually dragging children out of their homes in Yamit to give the land back to the Egyptians. But ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, even though Begin had a very hawkish personality, he nevertheless saw the opportunity for peace with Egypt, and it's ironic that he, of all the prime ministers, should be the one to actually seal that deal. I'm going to have to skip over the last couple things to stay on schedule, but his wife died in 1982, and Begin was never the same after that. She died when he was out of town. He was in Washington, and he retreated from public life, and he found that he did not have the heart to engage in political struggle anymore, so he eventually resigned shortly thereafterwards and essentially led a life of very deep seclusion. He had a heart attack in 1984 and ultimately passed away. I forgot to mention, by the way, that he was also a Nobel laureate for his signing of the peace treaty with Sadat. And Sadat, who also won the Nobel Prize, was later assassinated by his own bodyguard, who had become close with the Muslim Brotherhood. But when we look at the overall legacy of Menachem Begin, we see an individual of tremendous intellectual resolve, willing to undergo incredible privation for his vision of the Jewish people, enduring torture and imprisonment under the Soviets, subject to a massive manhunt by the British, excoriated by the political establishment in his own country, and yet at the same time it was only under his watch that we were able to establish this basically lasting peace accord with Egypt. Fascinating character of many contradictions. And with this, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to speaking with you next week.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Okay, the second video is about Yitzhak Rabin. You can tell by his date of birth that he's a younger man than these other men who were born in the 1800s. His life is more involved than with the 1948 and thereafter. And so we'll pick up with him and see about his life and the events of the Israeli struggle since the foundation or the establishment of Israel by the United Nations.
Let's go straight to the material then. Tonight's topic, fascinating topic, controversial topic, really someone who embodies a lot of the inner contradictions of the land of Israel in its contemporary attempt to be a modern state in an ancient biblical land. Even though he was born in Israel proper, he is the first ruler of Israel, first prime minister who was actually a Sabra born in Israel. He nevertheless, as according to one of his contemporaries, said he was the most secular Jew he had ever met. Ironically, but this is part of the contradictions that represents the state of Israel. He was born and grew up amidst a series of wars, and in fact you could tell his life story solely from the perspective of the wars. We will look at several of them in the course of our hour together. But at the end, he was ironically a man of peace, a controversial peace, and we'll look at the reasons for the controversy. He died ultimately, an assassin's bullet ended his life in 1995, and he is honored in Israel as a martyr for the cause of peace, and it is still an elusive peace to this very day. David, could I ask you to shut that door so I'm not distracted by the senator? Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go straight to the story of his life. Here's some photographs to give you a sense of his family background. Both his parents were socialist Zionists. His mother from Belarus was known as Red Rosa Cohen because of her socialist leanings. They were both especially attached to a party called the Poale Zion. We spoke about them very briefly last week. The Workers of Zion that tried to create a political philosophy very grounded in actual working of the soil that was a mixture of secular Zionism with Marxism. Ber Borochov was the principal ideologue behind this movement that had its greatest impact in the former Russian Empire, but many of the young people who were motivated by Borochov's ideas came to Israel and founded the kibbutz movement, and ultimately they formed the core of the Labor Party, which dominated Israeli politics up until the late 1970s. So here's a photograph of Red Rosa Cohen and her son Yitzhak on the right, and her daughter Rachel on the left over here. Here's another photograph with his father, also, of course, with his sister Rachel. Father Nechemya Rubitsov was from Ukraine. He actually emigrated to America, and he spent about a dozen years living in Chicago as a tailor, which was a traditional kind of trade for many Jewish immigrants, the needle trade. My own grandfather, Oliver Shalom, and my father, Oliver Shalom, were in the needle trade as well. Then he eventually moved to Israel, also for socialist Zionist reasons, where he met his wife, and they had their first son, Yitzhak, their only son, Yitzhak, in 1922. Later on, of course, Yitzhak went through the ranks, and in the context of World War II, he met his wife, Leah Schlossberg, and he married her. They remained married until his assassination in 1995, and she died 5 years later. She was, of course, very much intertwined with his political career, and we shall see that a small financial peccadillo actually brought him from government as a result of his wife's having a bank account that was illegal at the time. But let's come to that a little later. His life, as I mentioned, really could be traced out through a series of Israel's wars. I've only chosen a few of them because really we could go into tremendous detail on each one of them, but these wars were incredibly important for forming the national identity, and Rabin was personally connected to that identity. In fact, he was a role model for many Jews in understanding what was a sabra. The term, particularly for those on the internet, I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with the term sabra. It means cactus flower, and it's sort of like a symbol for the Jews who were born in Israel. Do they have a similar kind of thing for people who were born in New York? I don't. Brooklynites, but what does that mean? It's just a place name, right? They have like names for people who are born in certain places. I don't know. A sabra, the cactus flower, it's very luscious and moist on the inside, very tasty, but on the outside, of course, it's quite spiny and impossible to eat. And so that's sort of like an emblematic of the Israeli character, hard on the exterior and maybe gruff and rude, but on the inside very warm and hospitable and so on. When I lived in Israel back when I was 18, living on a kibbutz, there was this Australian guy, and we used to spend a lot of time together, Canadians and Australians, and beer. The three of us were inseparable. And I remember once he found a cactus flower, and he decided just to peel the outer skin very quickly with his knife, and he popped it into his mouth. Little did he realize, of course, that those mature spikes on the outside of the cactus actually come from little tiny immature hair-like spires on the inside of the cactus, and his mouth was full of these things. We had to go to the doctor, and they had to carefully tweezer them out one by one. What a story. Anyways, so he was a sabra who was formed in the crucible of Israel's wars. In particular, he was associated with a pre-state military formation called the Palmach, which later was absorbed into the Haganah, or the Defense Force, which became the Israel IDF, the Israel Defense Force, which is actually, the word Haganah, to defend, is built into the modern term for Tzahal, the forces for the defense of Israel in Hebrew. It was not an easy fit, and in fact, he in his memoirs, he wrote quite a bit about the small antagonisms he had with great figures such as Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, who wished to break up the Palmach and not allow them to have an individual identity within the IDF, but that's more of detail than we need to go into here. Let's have a look at Israel at the verge of its independence, because this is where he received most of his initial military experience. This is the 1947 UN partition treaty, or partition plan of 1947. You'll recall a very quick lightning tour. 1918, the British take over the land of Israel from the Ottoman Empire, and after a brief amount of negotiations, the United Nations, then called the League of Nations, really its predecessor, decided that the British should control all of that region, also Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan River, and so on. This left Israel in an administrative character called the British Mandate. It was controlled by Britain on behalf of the United Nations. The arrangement was not very workable. The Arabs were dissatisfied with the increasing Jewish immigration to Israel. The Jews moving to Israel wanted more power and more self-government, and this only accelerated after the Holocaust, when there were so many refugees, something like 20 million displaced people after the war ended, and many of them Jews wishing to go to a new homeland rather than try to recreate their lives in war-destroyed Poland. So ultimately what ended up happening is the British, after trying to negotiate between Jews and Arabs and finding themselves at the expense of violent attacks, they decided to simply give it back to the UN, and the UN thought about it for a while, and they came up with this very unworkable plan, which divided the land of Israel into 7 distinct sections. This sort of pinkish area here was supposed to be the Arab states, so there are 3 Arab state regions with very tiny connections between them. This sort of peachy green, orange color was to be Jewish, and finally the region of Jerusalem was to be an international zone. It belonged to the international community, would belong to neither Jews and Arabs. So when I teach this to undergraduates who are not necessarily familiar with the history of Israel, they're always amazed when I say to them that at this point, the Arab nations rejected this really bizarre, unworkable map, but the Jews, to my 18-year-old student's surprise, accepted it. Even though it was really an almost impossible amount of territory to defend, it of course did not include Jerusalem, and there was a huge swath of territory between Jewish areas and Jerusalem, which is long regarded by the Jews as their eternal capital. Nevertheless, the Jews accepted it. And war, of course, broke out almost immediately. You can see that even more in how serious it is in the next map that I will show you, right over here. This map shows you where Jews actually lived. I mean, the regions that we saw in the previous map were supposed to more or less correspond to the demographics, meaning where they gave territory to where Jews lived. It's actually even thinner. The number of Jews living in a lot of these regions was tiny. And so everyone expected at that time that the Jews, of course, would be thrown into the sea so shortly after the Holocaust, and after a brutal war of just over a year, they ended up being able to actually consolidate territory to the amazement of the world, and the State of Israel survived. Rabin was involved in several important maneuvers. At this point, we should recall that his genius was in logistics, in operations, which is a very important part of war, not so much the artillery or the SEALs or the Air Force, but in figuring out what goes where, what has to be placed where and when in order for the troops to succeed. Supply lines and munitions and things like that. So he was charged with finding a way to get from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. You can see the blue areas here are Jewish populations, but the single road that connected them went through a heavily populated Arab area here around the town of Latrun. And it was the site of really serious battles on that single road. There was no way to get around this particular pass where the Arabs could easily ambush Jewish convoys. So Rabin came up with a rather simple but quite ingenious idea to simply bypass Latrun, and he managed to build a very rapidly constructed road, paving it with remarkable speed and enabling essentially the Jewish convoys to make their way from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem without harm. And that was a signal victory without actually engaging in hostilities. And it's characteristic of a lot of things that he was especially good at. After the war, he was invited to participate in the armistice talks. Here's a picture of him. They actually, just to give you a sense of what the Israeli army was like at the time, he had no dress uniforms. They did not issue dress uniforms to their soldiers, a very intentionally casual army, but you couldn't show up to these armistice talks wearing your regular khakis. So they got some World War II uniforms that were hand-me-downs. Remember, this is 1950 already, so it's 5 years after the war, and several people had worn these dress uniforms from a used shop before him. They were ill-fitting, and he put it on. He also he relates in his memoir a funny story that some members of the Arab delegation found out a deeply held secret that he was very embarrassed about. He could never manage to learn. Perhaps he learned later in life, but at that point, when he was about late 20s, he didn't know how to tie a tie. And so he actually had a friend tie it for him and leave it on his neck, and he would just loosen the knot every time he needed to take it on and put it off. But he happened to go for a haircut at the same time as one of the members of the Arab delegation, and they saw him loosening his tie, and he was deeply embarrassed. I mean, it's an interesting kind of story because it tells you something about the character of the Israeli army at that time, intentionally casual and, very much down to earth and without formalities. The next major war in his life and in the life of Israel was just under 20 years later. We'll skip over this. There are smaller skirmishes of nevertheless great importance, the 1956 Sinai campaign in which he was involved, but the Six-Day War is the most momentous, perhaps of all battles that Israel has ever been involved with. And in fact, we are right now just about at the anniversary of the Six-Day War, the 50th anniversary. The so-called Yom Yerushalayim, the Day of Jerusalem, is on Wednesday, which celebrates the recapture, the reunification of East Jerusalem, which had been cut off from Jews since 1948-49. At any rate, what exactly happened here? We're just going to quickly skim over some of the main facts. I'm sure most of you are very aware of the broad strokes of the war, but we'll focus on Rabin in particular. This man, Gamal Abdel Nasser, leader of Egypt, was an extremely bellicose individual who managed to engineer a political alignment with Syria that was very significant. Syria, of course, is to Israel's northeast, and Egypt is to its southwest. And Israel was trapped, as it were, between the pincers formed by Egypt and Syria. Their strong political alliance was extremely deleterious to Israel at the time. And tensions with Israel since the War of Independence were really running quite high. Rabin was to some degree, at this point he was involved as Minister of Defense, I believe. Israel, and Rabin in particular, was to some degree responsible for the escalation of tension in the late 1960s. There were skirmishes in the north, in particular around the Golan Heights, that had to do with various projects to divert water, the national water carrier in Israel that would bring water down from the Lake Kinneret, for example. And there was actually an incident in which there was a dogfight between Soviet MiG fighters and Israeli jets that had launched from northern Syria. So there was a certain amount of tension that Rabin himself was responsible for which he was deeply criticized by many of his rivals in the Israeli government. At any rate, Nasser's response was to mass all of his troops in concert with Syrian troops, Jordanian troops, and Iraqi troops, and to threaten the borders of Israel. Israel was heavily outnumbered by tanks, aircraft, not quite outnumbered in terms of troops, but the only way that Israel would be able to actually amass the same number of troops to fight against these soldiers from the army would be to pull up every single one of their reservists, which would totally paralyze the country economically and otherwise. It means every single person of fighting age brought to the front lines. So Israel was clearly outgunned and pretty much outmanned by all of the other armies at the same time. And Egypt, in a very bellicose way, threatened the United Nations and challenged them to remove their observers from the border that was separating Israel and Egypt. Perhaps to Nasser's surprise, the Secretary General of the UN actually did so. He actually abandoned the front line. There are some theorists that say that Nasser was expecting that this is part of the rhetoric, and you make these noises and the UN might retreat to a part of the border, but he simply removed the border, and this, to a certain degree, that meant that the region was going to spiral into war. There's also some interesting questions about how much Nasser knew and what exactly he thought about what Israel was doing, because he got some misinformation from the Soviets. Oh, definitely. The Soviets are heavily involved in this. Let's just remember, this is before Vietnam, but after Korea. So we're talking about the Arabs and the Israelis are fighting a proxy war on behalf of the Soviets and the Americans, respectively. So the signals confusion between these four parties and their overlapping but not at all identical political and foreign policy objectives often meant there was a lot of confusion on the ground. For example, one of the most bizarre incidents in the war that brought us much closer to that DEFCON 3 moment was when the Israelis fired on an American vessel in the Mediterranean. The Israelis had thought originally that it was an Arab vessel that had entered its waters. And then later, for a moment, they had a bone-curdling thought that perhaps it was the Soviets that they had actually fired upon, and that would draw the Soviets into the war. And then they found out actually it was the Americans. They had just sunk an American ship. And they immediately sent apologies straight back to Washington and so on. And don't forget, when I say immediately, this is 1967 we're talking about. So immediately is kind of like a few pigeons flying very fast, by comparison to internet speeds. I know no one's laughing here. I thought it was funny. But, they use cables. That's the best they would have. It's even before fax machines. So it turned out that America, there was a signals confusion, and they had told all of their boats, as they were told in advance that Israel was going to attack. They had removed all their boats in these waters, but they had neglected to inform this one particular boat. And so this one particular boat was in harm's way, and when it was fired on, the Americans actually thought it was the Soviets who had sank them. And if the Americans thought it was the Soviets, then they would go to war with the Soviet Union, and we would risk Armageddon. Okay. Back to where we are. They launch around all this area, and then at this point, Rabin, who you will recall is Minister of Defense, deeply involved in this, and may be to some degree responsible for the escalation of tensions. It's rapidly getting out of control. The leadership of the military and political elite of Israel are really not certain what to do, because if they enter into war, it's quite likely that Israel would be destroyed. Rabin has a nervous breakdown of some kind. His rival Moshe Dayan would step in. What exactly was this nervous breakdown? It's kind of a bizarre story. Rabin, in his memoirs, he attributed it to literally nicotine poisoning. He had been going without sleep for several days on end, smoking one cigarette after another. This is Israel in the 1960s, after all. And the combination of the stress, the exhaustion, the tension, and all this nicotine just laid him out for 30 hours straight. And this is a really bad time for the Minister of Defense to be offline. To think of him as not being involved in it, just disappearing, it was terrible. And many of his rivals, including Moshe Dayan, Eitzer Weizmann, and others, felt that, that's it. He's out. We can't rely on him. He is emotionally too weak for this position. He managed, after he slept for nearly 2 days, he came back to himself, and he managed to reassert himself, but there was a lot of questions about his reliability after that one night. He's not even sure how to respond to it. But at any rate, the decision was made that Israel would launch a preemptive strike. And this has been a controversial decision, but ultimately it was of huge consequence for Israel as a nation. They took advantage of several factors related to their air superiority. Israel was outnumbered in terms of fighter planes, but they were much better trained. And again, you can see Rabin's influence here. They had much better logistics. They were able to fly 4 sorties a day, whereas the Egyptians were used to flying 1 or at most 2. And so they planned for a dawn raid. They also did some really good intelligence analysis of when the Egyptian pilots had breakfast. And they tended to fly all of their planes out at the same time in the pre-dawn hours. They would come back for breakfast at exactly 7 a.m. And at that point, all their planes would be on the ground while they were inside having couscous and hard-boiled eggs. So the Israelis planned that attack for the very first wave to go over the Suez Canal, and amazingly, they planned 3 waves of attacks, but the first wave completely decimated the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. They were completely destroyed. Photographs like this of planes and runways completely destroyed. This one actually has been a bit cleared. Actually, I'm not even sure this is a runway, but once they demonstrated air superiority over Egypt, they had the run of the skies, and the rest of the war basically fell into place with remarkable precision. So it was a tremendous execution. The planning that went into it, it was executed flawlessly, and the war was an amazing success. What ended up happening was, and really you have to imagine that prior to the outbreak of the war, everyone was thinking this is going to be it. This is disaster. Israel is all over. It's going to be another Holocaust. Jews from all around the world. My uncle, for example, talks about how he rushed around to get an airline ticket to get to Israel, but by the time his flight was about to leave, the war was already over. It was like a phenomenal turnaround of global proportions. This yellow here shows you the armistice line of 1949, that is after the War of Independence that gave Israel its statehood. Israel conquered the entire Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip here, the region which goes by its biblical names, Shomron and Yehuda, or by its contemporary term, the West Bank, because the West Bank of Jordan, and that sort of peachy color in the top is the Golan Heights, a region in the north that separates Israel and Syria. It was a victory beyond all proportions. They had no idea that they were actually going to conquer this much territory. And in fact, it would prove to be quite an albatross that Israel would have to deal with, because immediately afterwards, the Israeli elite was thinking, okay, great, we conquered all this territory. Now all we have to do is wait for the Arab nations to call us up, and we'll make a deal. We'll trade land for peace, and we'll finally have peace. The problem is that the phone call did not come for another 10 years, and they had a couple of wars in the meantime, so things did not work out as planned. But in 1967, it was an overwhelming Israeli victory that the rest of the world really could not comprehend. Perhaps the most significant element of that war, on an emotional level, of course, is the reunification of Jerusalem, which was captured in this iconic photograph. The old city, in particular the Kotel, the western wall of the old temple, that was the center of Jewish worship for thousands of years, was cut off to Jews after 1949. And with the recapture of Jerusalem in this war, with very heavy, door-to-door fighting in the old city, when it once again came under Israeli control, it was more than just a certain amount of territory. This was like capturing the capital city. It was the golden prize, and it brought tears to the eyes of Jews all around the world that the Kotel was once again under Israeli control. So Rabin goes on from here to eventually become the Prime Minister of Israel. The most significant thing that happens in the meantime, of course, is the Yom Kippur War, which immediately preceded his rise to becoming Prime Minister. The Yom Kippur War, which we won't go into in great detail, but was engineered by this man, Anwar Sadat, also the Prime Minister of Egypt, and he was able to launch a surprise attack on the holiest day of the Jewish year, when Jews were all fasting and so on. It was a huge soul-searching moment for the State of Israel. They were able, of course, to eventually push back the attackers, but only after a great number of casualties. And it proved that the sense of Davidic-like superiority that had overwhelmed the Israelis in 1967 could not be guaranteed. And that was true for the Israeli mentality and also true for the Arab mentality, because it showed that the Jews could get a bloody nose in the sense of the horrible devastation of the Yom Kippur War. And it also meant that Anwar Sadat, once he had, even though he didn't really win that war, the borders were pushed right back to where they were prior to the war. Nevertheless, he showed that he could inflict damage on the Israelis, which gave him a sense of pride once again, gave the nation of Egypt a sense of pride. And then the tables were more level, as it were, and he was able to reach out to the Israelis amazingly and sue for peace. And so, in fact, over the course of the next few years, Egypt and Israel would eventually dictate a peace treaty. This would be a traditional land for peace deal in which the Sinai Peninsula was given back to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians then respected the border with Israel. Gaza, however, was very problematic. Egypt did not want to take Gaza back. It was heavily populated, a lot of unhappy people living there, and they left it in Israel's backyard. But during this time, Shimon Peres emerged as Rabin's greatest rival. The two of them worked together on so many things. They were both labor Zionists. They were both in the same political party. But Rabin was more hawkish, and Peres was more dovish. Peres really wanted to make more efforts to make peace with the surrounding Arab peoples, and later, of course, with the Palestinians living within Israel proper. And Rabin, through most of his life, until really the very end, he was much more in favor of the iron fist. He was much more in favor of using force to be able to achieve political aims. He was a child of the 1967 war, the War of Independence, like Peres, but definitely not similarly minded. At this point, he became prime minister after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and he came into conflict with the religious parties. And I'd like to mention this particular incident primarily because it sort of demonstrates the fissures within Israeli society per se. the Israeli governments are not formed the same way the American government is. Here in America, we basically have a binary political system where the ruling party, with very few exceptions in American history and only weird kind of things back like who knows when in the 1800s, it's either Democrat or Republican. You can only have either or. You can't really, independents really don't have a stake or a chance to win the election. That's the way Americans think, I believe. But in Israel, you can't have that. In Israel, there are so many gradations of political opinion, and the spectrum is so much broader that they have literally tens of political parties, none of which has ever been able to achieve majority status. You have 120 seats in Knesset, never has a political party been able to get 61 of those. So every single government has to be a coalition. Let's say one of the big parties gets 40 seats. Let's say Rabin's Party of Labor gets 40 seats. So they have to make deals with 21 other parties or 21 other seats, which are in smaller blocks. The vegetarians have 3 seats. Maybe we can make a deal with them, lower prices on carrots, and the communists, they want, a particular type of school system. Fine, we'll deal with them. And then a government, once they get 21 seats, they get 61 altogether, then they have a bloc and they can rule the government. That's a coalition-style government. So it really depends on a lot of internal negotiation between these various political movements. And one of the most common marriages of convenience up until the 1970s in particular, was of these socialist, anti-religious Zionists, like Rabin, and the religious parties. The Agudat Yisrael, the Degel HaTorah, different parties like this. So one of the specific incidents that came up was over a gift to, or a sale to Israel of several F-15 fighters from the United States. And the Israeli government scheduled the arrival of those planes on Israeli territory on a Friday afternoon, which is not wise because, you have to schlep around and you have to get things ready for Shabbos and you have to light candles and things like that. Having all these expensive planes fly in on a Friday afternoon means that someone is going to desecrate the Sabbath. And so the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox Agudat Yisrael party, voted on a motion of no confidence, meaning they were so upset with this government for breaking what was the religious standard, as they felt, so they wanted to get 60 other seats to agree that we should drop out of this government. That's another thing that doesn't happen so much in America. In this country, if you want to change the government outside of the regular election cycles, you have to impeach somebody or shoot somebody, God forbid. That happens too. But, basically, you have to have a real trauma to get off that cycle. In Israel, all you have to do is have one vote of no confidence, and if 61 seats vote they have no confidence in leadership, new elections. And it could be 3 weeks after the last elections. You never really know. So the Agudat Yisrael said, what a shanda, what a chilul Hashem, what a desecration of God's name that we should have these F-15 fighters land on Erev Shabbat. We vote no confidence. So Agudat Yisrael was not part of the coalition, but the National Religious Party, who were more moderate Zionists. They were, in what one of my friends calls yarmulke culture, they tended to wear the white knitted kippot with the blue emblems on it, so they're more Zionistic, but also observant of Shabbat. They didn't want to bring the government down, but they didn't want to acquiesce to the Agudat Yisrael either, so what they did was they abstained from voting. And Rabin was just incensed with them. He had a huge fight, kicked them out of the government. It was a big mess. And I put this today's article from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency to show you that, like my father, although Shalom used to say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, these kinds of fights over flying on Shabbat exist even today. Okay, but what really brought Rabin down, and this is one of these great ironies of Israeli politics, I skipped over very quickly that he spent many years as an ambassador here in Washington. And his wife and he had an American bank account with about $10,000 American dollars in it. In the late 70s and early 80s, Israel was going through a tremendous period of hyperinflation, where, I mean, I was living there at that time, and I used to work in a pizza shop called Richie's Cardo Cafe. And every Friday, or whatever day it was that we used to get paid, they would calculate how much we would get paid against the American dollar, because we didn't know what the exchange rate was going to be any given week. Nobody got paid in dollars because they didn't have them. You always got paid in shekels, but the shekels were calculated against the value of the dollar because it could vary from week to week. So in an attempt to try and control the currency, they put in place a regulation. No Israeli is allowed to have a foreign bank account. That was considered unpatriotic because you're protecting your money outside of the country. We need your money right here inside Bank Leumi and Bank Hapoalim. We don't want you to put your money into, I don't know, the Chase or whatever it was. So when a journalist discovered that Leah Rabin had a bank account from when she was the ambassador's wife here in Washington, it was a huge scandal, and it actually forced Rabin to resign from the government, and new elections were held as a result. Gives you a sense of the kind of the tenor of the age. That law no longer applies. You can have as many bank accounts as you want. Thank God the economy there is much better. But the real devastation to Rabin's party occurred later on in the 1970s when you had a major revolution in Israeli political culture. Up until this point, from the first election in the late 1940s to the late 1970s, Israel's political establishment was dominated by the Ashkenazi Eastern European elite. Rabin was a bit of an exception because he was a Sabra, born in Israel, but he was, of course, of Ashkenazi extraction, and there was this, kind of sense of entitlement that the Ashkenazim were much more civilized, much more cultured, much more educated. These Sephardim, coming from Arab lands in particular, the Edut HaMizrach, the Yemenites, and things like that, there was a feeling like we have the white man's burden with regards these other Jews. And there was really an apartheid-like society in many ways between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. So in the late 1970s, there was like this internal revolution where the Sephardim rose up and they said, we are just not going to support this socialist Zionist model that is hostile to our religious values, and we don't like all this dovish stuff, especially that we hear from Shimon Peres, and they voted for a new party, Likud, under the leadership of this man, Menachem Begin, who was a follower of Vladimir Jabotinsky. You recall we spoke about him many, many months ago. Menachem Begin, much more hawkish than anyone out there, much more religious, much more nationalistic. And in 1977, there was a huge revolution within the mindset of Israelis. It was the renaissance of the Sephardic bloc of voters that has had a continuing influence to the present day. Okay. Now to the last period of Rabin's life, and very significant in many ways. Rabin was still at the very top of power. Don't forget, even when Begin came to power in 1977, he did not have a majority government. He still had a minority government which had to have the participation of various other parties. And we should recall that the way they choose members to occupy certain seats in the government, the ministry, is that each party populates a ticket with a number 1 member of the party, number 2 member of the party, number 3 member of the party, and when they negotiate seats in the Knesset and ministries, they give those ministries to the top members of each of those lists. So even though Rabin's party was not in power, he was very close to the top of the list, if not at the top, and so quite often he was occupying a ministerial post. It was in this context that he was called upon to deal with the first Intifada. The Intifada is something which has grown in Israel, unfortunately, and has become a persistent problem for the state. It refers, and I wish we had a lot more time to talk about this, but it refers to a very important change in tactics on the part of the Palestinians in particular. I will use that term specifically now rather than Arabs, because in the 1960s, that's when the concept of Palestinian, as distinct from Arabs who live in Israel, became very prominent. The Palestinians at this point had organized themselves, and in many ways the Palestinians had expressed their lack of confidence in their Arab leaders of other lands, and the leaders of Egypt, leaders of Syria. They said, like, what have you done for us lately? You keep on having these big wars, but, what do we get out of it? In the end, you'll make a peace deal like Egypt, and we get nothing out of it. So the Palestinians, beginning in the late 1980s, began to mobilize themselves for a grassroots uprising against Israel. I remember distinctly, because I lived in Israel in the early 80s, how, I'm sure many of you were there at that time, how amazingly safe it was. Like, even though you did have the occasional horrible terrorist attack, you could walk with ease through Arab neighborhoods, identifying as a Jew, and no one would bother you. I was studying at Hebrew University at the time. I used to live on Har HaTzofim, the Mount Scopus campus, which is kind of separate from Jerusalem. And I used to, every day walk down the hill, walk through the Arab neighborhood, through the Arab quarter of the Old City, to my job in the Jewish quarter of the Old City. And then I would walk back at night, and it was no problem whatsoever. It was just, some guy walking in the street. But that you couldn't say that 5 years later after the Intifada began. The tactics of the Intifada involved low-level resistance, acts of smaller violence, acts of disobedience that the big guns of the Israeli defense establishment were not capable of handling. Rock throwing became the emblematic form of resistance, especially by children and youths, because Israel might have had all of these fantastic tanks and these bazookas and fighter planes, but how do you use those things effectively against children throwing stones? The stones are dangerous, so you have to do something about it, but how do you possibly control it with a modern military? And also add to the fact that Israel is a democracy with a free press, an incredibly free press, and there are always photographers around. Sometimes these events are even staged. Israel was terribly losing the propaganda war over the impression of how they were handling their Arab populations. So the Intifada, although it did not achieve any great military aims, it nevertheless changed the paradigm of the image of who was Israel and who were the Palestinians in this context. And we still live with that major paradigm shift where suddenly Israel is the aggressor, Israel is the Goliath, no longer the David, and Israel has attempted with only limited success to try and change that narrative, which is very widely endorsed in much of contemporary society, particularly in the universities that are our competitors. That's why all of you Jewish students out there who want to get an undergraduate education should come here, because we don't have to deal with that. At any rate, Rabin tried the hard fist. He imported methods used in South Africa to try and quell disturbances against apartheid with rubber bullets and water cannons and various types of armed personnel carriers, and it just dug a deeper and deeper hole every time there was a small incident of rock throwing on the news. And he was simply not succeeding against this. The Intifada, the word apparently, I don't know Arabic, but it apparently is the term used for like a violent shaking, like when a dog is wet and wants to shake off the water. Like instead of having the PLO's troops in Egypt or the Syrians, the Lebanese, and so on come in and invade, it was going to be like a shaking off the Israelis kind of mentality. And it was very heavily practiced in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and Israel had to cope by trying to limit the civil rights of non-Israeli citizens, where movement was restricted, the checkpoints were put in place, bags were checked for bombs everywhere you went, and ultimately, under Sharon, much later, an actual physical wall was built to try and separate the Arab citizens living, or the Arab population in Israel, the Palestinians, from the Jewish population. It should also be noted, of course, that there are 750,000 Arab citizens of Israel who have freedom of movement throughout the country and on occasion would collude with non-citizens from the West Bank and Gaza, which only made the Intifada all the worse. And there was no easy solution in sight, certainly not then. Even today, it still remains a deep problem. So what he did was very counterintuitive for his life history. And this is probably why he is so controversial among many circles today. He decided that if he could not win this war with arms, he would win it with peace. Very dramatic gesture, a 180-degree turnaround for much of his way of thinking. Part of the reason for this was because now we're getting to the first Intifada started in 1986. By 1991, the Soviet Union was collapsing. And you'll recall that most of the traditional Arab-Israeli conflict was predicated on the support of the Americans for the Israelis and the Soviet Union for the Palestinians. When the Soviet Union itself was disappearing, there was a real fear what would happen to the Palestinian movement. Many people who might have been more short-sighted politically would say, well, this is great. The Palestinians will have less funds flowing to their central organizations, and therefore they will be weaker. Rabin's thinking was, wait a second, right now I deal primarily with one enemy. His name is Yasser Arafat. He's the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Israel did a great job of making sure he was unwelcome in any of the countries that bordered Israel. They actually waged wars against Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Arafat at this point was forced to live in Tunis because he was not welcomed in any of those Arab nations. He was still the figurehead, though, of the Palestinian movement. And Rabin's thinking was, if I don't make peace with Yasser Arafat now, then I will have to fight against 1,000 Yasser Arafats who command much smaller but very dangerous groups of terrorists. So Rabin, in many ways like Anwar Sadat, took the first step and he picked up the phone to speak to Yasser Arafat and propose discussions for peace. Ironically, like Anwar Sadat, he was assassinated by a compatriot for this very bold decision. But what ended up happening is Arafat chose to take him up on this offer, and in this iconic photograph, brokered by the Americans under Bill Clinton, they actually struck a deal called the Oslo Accords, because much of the negotiation took place in Oslo, Norway. This is essentially the foundation of America, actually up until today, because we don't know what happened in Israel. We'll have to read Trump's speech later, President Trump's speech. But up until today, the so-called roadmap that has been followed by all of the European nations, led by America, has argued towards implementing some version of the Oslo Accords of 1993. Basically, what do they ask for? Accepting Gaza, which no longer was relevant because in 2003, under a different administration, Israel simply abandoned Gaza to the Arabs living there. In the West Bank in particular, the idea was to slowly establish confidence-building measures that would allow Israel a sense of security, living next to a demilitarized Palestinian state. And so they looked at the demographics in the region. They set aside Jerusalem because they knew it was too thorny an issue. The Palestinians regard Jerusalem as their capital, as the Jews also regard it as theirs. And so they said, okay, those areas where there's lots of Palestinians, Area A, we will give the Palestinians local control of things like sanitation, local policing, education, whatever it is that they want to do for self-government, the Israelis will allow that to happen. In other areas, there will be Palestinian administration, but the Israelis will maintain security in these kind of greenish, yellow areas here. And in the white areas in between, the area C, it's areas that still have to be negotiated. That's the core of the Oslo Accords. The goal was the Palestinians would slowly demonstrate that they are capable of preventing acts of terror against the Israelis. The Israelis would slowly retreat from political and even territorial control over these regions, and gradually, the theory went, they would move towards a two-state solution. Obviously, here we are 20 years later, 20 years later, 20 and some, 25 odd years later, and we still don't have it for a variety of reasons, but the Palestinians were incapable of taking those measures. There continued to be a wave of horrific suicide attacks, especially in the early 2000s, and Palestinians will say that Israel reneges on its part of the deal by continuing to build settlements. Settlements are facts on the ground, meaning once you've got a group of people living in a place, it is incredibly difficult to uproot them and move them away. And so there's this ongoing back and forth between both groups. I'm not here to give a political equivalency between those the arguments, but nevertheless, that is where we are deadlocked to this day. For his part, Rabin was praised by the global community and by Israelis to left of center in particular for taking this bold move and actually, they felt, kind of guaranteeing some safety for the Israelis. I see your question just a second. But on the other hand, many Israelis felt that this was a betrayal of Israeli values because he was giving away some of the cherished land of Israel itself. This has both political consequences, security consequences, and perhaps most significantly, religious consequences, because many in Israeli society felt that the land of Israel would expand in order to absorb the immigrants that would return to Israel along with the coming of the Messiah. And so by ceding land, you're actually stepping backwards from the unfolding of the Messianic era. And Rabin came under incredible criticism as a result. So much so that even though, as you can see in this picture here, he won the Nobel Prize for Peace, he shares it here with Yasser Arafat and Shimon Peres, he does not look terribly thrilled to be receiving it. Maybe he's not terribly thrilled to be standing on the same stage with Arafat, because he's now the former hawk who is now receiving the Peace Prize. But this man, Yigal Amir, in 1995, approached Rabin in a public square and shot him in the back several times in revenge for enacting the Oslo Peace Accords. The spot where he is buried is now a national monument and a shrine, and he was eulogized by world figures all over, not the least of which is Bill Clinton, who famously said of him, in Hebrew, Shalom Chaver, goodbye, my friend. So with that, we'll conclude the remarks on a complex figure, played a great role in the shaping of Israel's polity, a war hero who became a dove, someone who left a lasting mark on the land of Israel. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to speaking with you next semester. Yes.
Okay, let's first of all determine that you can hear me. I've switched microphones. So let's see if you can hear me now.
We hear you.
Okay, so that's good.
Yes.
That's a good thing. All right, very good. Here, I'm trying to get to the right place here. Let me go backwards. Well, come on, go backwards. Well, we will go through this list of the prime ministers of Israel from 48 on until 2021 and look at them. Really just look at the list. We're not going to study any of them in particular. And so next week, we will look at current Israeli politics. You've seen in the last couple the breakdown of the political parties and what is happening with that. We'll probably spend the first hour on the results of the last election and looking at who the principal actors are in Israel now. And then the second hour, we probably will transition into the New Testament and look to see who is a Jew and who is not a Jew from what is revealed in the writings of the New Testament. So we'll conclude today with a prayer. Father, we are grateful for your grace. We're grateful for your love for us, your salvation, provision for us. We're grateful for your word that gives us guidance in understanding things that are occurring in the world. And we pray that our journey into secular history has been a fruitful one, that we have learned a lot about Israel's history and how things have been shaped due to the circumstances that they have suffered and enjoyed over the course of their history, and how it has led Israel to the point where it is now, and how that affects their relationship with you. We thank you for our time again. Ask that you bless it in Jesus' name. Amen.